Welcome back to another video. Today I will be doing a website read from the website futurism.com. Under Purity Vulture, written on November 8th, 2024 by Noor Al-Sibai. We're reading an article with the title, Researchers Confirm that Conservative Christian Women Are Having Horrible Sex. Quote, seeing sex as a female obligation and a male entitlement leads to horrible sex, frankly. End quote. Below that, we see an image of a woman in white with her fingers and palms pressed together tightly towards her lips. The article reads as follows. A new study seems to confirm something tragic. That conservative women are having terrible sex with the conservative Christian men in their lives. In a new study published in the Sociology of Religion, linked here, researchers from multiple Canadian universities found that conservative religious ideals of sexual purity are connected to both an increase in sexual pain disorders and a decrease in marital satisfaction. With a decades-long rise of so-called, quote, purity culture, unquote, which centers around the concept that sex before marriage can damage a woman spiritually and that her body and sexuality are, quote, gifts, unquote, to only be enjoyed by her husband, the Canadian sexual psychology researchers, say that 3 times fast, decided to ask conservative Christian women directly about both their beliefs on sexual purity and their sexual experiences. In an interview with SciPost, linked here, about the new paper, lead author Joanna Sawatsky of the University of Saskatchewan said that after she and her co-authors read best-selling Christian marriage and sex books, they were, quote, appalled, unquote, to see the kind of advice they were giving women that, quote, completely erased women's sexuality, made sex into a power struggle, and presented men as sexually uncontrollable beings, end quote. Quote, it made us concerned that much of the advice given in these circles makes marriage and sex worse, not better, end quote, Sawatsky said. Quote, and we decided to do a research study to test our hypothesis, end quote. Using the, quote, snowball sampling, end quote, technique. For more information on that, linked here, which involves asking participants to refer their friends and associates as a recruiting tactic, the researchers ended up talking to more than 5,000 mostly American Christian women, most of whom were white and evangelical. They asked the subjects about their own perceived relationship between purity and marital and sexual satisfaction, as well as their experience with sexual pain. Unsurprisingly, the researchers found that the women who ascribed most fully to beliefs in sexual purity experienced higher rates of sexual pain disorders, especially for the subset of the subject population that had begun believing in those mores during adolescence and early adulthood. For instance, the researchers found that women who had believed in the concept of, quote, soul ties, unquote, the idea that people are forever linked spiritually when they have sex, when they were teens, were more likely to experience vaginismus, a disorder that occurs when the vagina involuntarily contracts during intercourse, resulting in very painful sex. Like vulvodynia, which is characterized by irritation and burning on the vulva, the exact cause of vaginismus is unknown, though it's often theorized to be psychosomatic in nature. Linked here. Ultimately, the researchers concluded that viewing sex as sinful and risky could be causing some conservative Christian women who ascribe to purity culture to have trauma-like responses during intercourse. Quote, seeing sex as a female obligation and a male entitlement leads to horrible sex, frankly, unquote, Sawatsky said. Quote, it's highly destructive to women's marital and sexual satisfaction and is even associated with higher rates of sexual pain disorders, end quote. With conservative Christians having newly ushered abstinence-only advocate Donald Trump back into the White House, it's unlikely that better sexual education will be available in red states anytime soon. That means those who have purity culture ingrained in them during puberty over the next 4 years are, unfortunately, going to keep this cruel and painful cycle going. Here ends the article. Here is the SciPost article, titled Purity Culture Equals Horrible Sex, New research sheds light on white Christian women's sexual well-being, written by Eric W. Dolan, November 7th, 2024. I read, a recent study published in the journal Sociology of Religion has revealed a connection between adherence to purity culture ideals and increased rates of sexual pain disorders among white American Christian women. The study found that belief in certain purity culture principles was linked to both higher rates of sexual pain and lower satisfaction in marriages. However, women who had never internalized these beliefs tended to have more satisfying relationships. Purity culture gained prominence in American evangelical circles during the 1990s and 2000s. The movement emphasizes strict sexual abstinence before marriage and advocates for traditional gender roles within marriage. The ideology is centered around maintaining a woman's, quote, purity, end quote, often framing premarital sex as damaging to a woman's spiritual and physical well-being. This movement promotes the idea that women should preserve themselves as, quote, gifts, end quote, for their husbands, discouraging behaviors deemed, quote, provocative, end quote, to prevent inciting male desire. In marriage, purity culture often portrays women as responsible for fulfilling their husband's sexual needs, teaching that it's a wife's duty to be constantly available to prevent marital problems. These teachings are frequently accompanied by metaphors, such as comparing women who have had premarital sex to, quote, chewed up gum, end quote, or, quote, crumpled petals, end quote, which can foster shame and guilt around sexuality, particularly for women. The motivation behind the new study was to investigate the long-term effects of purity culture teachings on married women, specifically exploring the impacts on marital satisfaction, and sexual pain disorders. While purity culture's rhetoric often focuses on abstinence and, quote, saving oneself, end quote, for marriage, these teachings extend well beyond the wedding day, affecting how women view sex and their roles within marriage. Researchers Joanna Sawatsky, Rebecca Lindenbach, Sheila Ray Gregar, and Keith Gregar saw an important gap in understanding how these beliefs impact married women's experiences. Quote, Sheila Gregar has been a prolific blogger, speaker, and writer in the evangelical marriage and sex space for over a decade. And Rebecca and I worked on her website too, end quote, explained Sawatsky, the research coordinator at Bare Marriage and co-author of The Great Sex Rescue, both of which linked here. Quote, in January of 2019, we actually read for the first time some of the best-selling Christian marriage and sex resources, and were appalled to see how many teachings in these books completely erased women's sexuality, made sex into a power struggle, and presented men as sexually uncontrollable beings. It made us concerned that much of the advice given in these circles makes marriage and sex worse, not better, and we decided to do a research study to test our hypothesis, end quote. The study included a large sample of 5,489 white American Christian women recruited through snowball sampling, aiming to explore the impact of purity culture beliefs on marital satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, and experiences of sexual pain disorders. This sample consisted of mostly white women who identified as evangelical Christians and regularly attended church, reflecting the demographic that purity culture primarily targets. The researchers assessed participants' past and current beliefs in various purity culture tropes and measured these beliefs in relation to three key outcomes: marital satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, and sexual pain disorders, such as vaginismus and vulvodynia, which are conditions that cause pain during sex without clear physical causes. To examine the impact of purity culture beliefs, the study focused on 6 main tropes commonly found in evangelical teachings. These included, quote, gatekeeping, end quote, parentheses, the belief that women must be modest to curb male sexual desire, end parentheses, quote, perpetual lust, end quote, parentheses, the idea that men are inherently lustful and women must accommodate this, end parentheses, and, quote, soul ties, end quote, parentheses, the belief that premarital sex creates lasting bonds that damage future relationships, end parentheses. Other tropes involved in this study addressed women's roles in marriage, such as the, quote, obligation sex, end quote, trope, which suggests that a wife must provide sex to maintain her husband's happiness and fidelity. and, quote, sexual methadone, end quote, which implies that women should engage in sexual activities to prevent their husbands from seeking satisfaction outside the marriage. Participants rated their agreement with each belief at two different stages: during adolescence, parentheses, often high school, end parentheses, or engagement, parentheses, before marriage, end parentheses, and in the present. By comparing participants' reported beliefs at these 2 points, the researchers were able to determine who had retained, rejected, or never held these beliefs. For instance, women who reported high agreement with a trope during adolescence but low or no agreement currently were categorized as having, quote, deconstructed, end quote, that belief. The findings showed that belief in these purity culture tropes, especially during adolescence and early adulthood, was linked to higher rates of sexual pain disorders, particularly among women who had since deconstructed these beliefs. For example, women who believed in the concept of, quote, soul ties, unquote, during high school were more likely to experience vaginismus, which causes involuntary muscle tightening and painful intercourse. The researchers suggested that the mental and emotional stress associated with purity culture teachings, such as viewing sex as risky or sinful, could contribute to a trauma-like response in the body, manifesting as sexual pain disorders. Quote, seeing sex as a female obligation and a male entitlement leads to horrible sex, frankly, end quote, Sawatsky told SciPost. Quote, it's highly destructive to women's marital and sexual satisfaction and is even associated with higher rates of sexual pain disorders, end quote. When it came to marital and sexual satisfaction, the findings were nuanced. Women who maintained purity culture beliefs generally reported lower sexual and marital satisfaction, especially if their beliefs revolved around sexual gatekeeping and perpetual lust. But those who deconstructed coercive beliefs, such as the idea of sex as a wife's obligation, often had lower marital satisfaction compared to women who still adhered to these ideals. Women who never believed these tropes had the highest levels of marital and sexual satisfaction, suggesting a protective effect for women who had never internalized purity culture teachings. Quote, deconstruction is a really, quote, sexy, end quote, term regarding American Christianity these days, especially white American evangelicalism, end quote, Sawatsky explained. Quote, it's typically framed in black or white terms. Deconstructing is good because it means a personal quest for truth, or deconstructing is bad because it provides an excuse to act outside the norms of religious communities. And of course, that can come with a lot of baggage about who is, quote, better, end quote. It can essentially become a test of personal righteousness in religious spaces, end quote. Quote, we actually found a mixed result, deconstructing some purity culture tropes, parentheses, e.g., all men are perpetually lusting, end parentheses, was associated with better outcomes while deconstructing others, parentheses, e.g., that divorce is acceptable in cases other than affairs, end parentheses, was associated with worse outcomes. And that makes sense. Humans are rational beings who will question beliefs that no longer serve them, but retain beliefs that are consistent with their environment, end quote. Quote, people in happy marriages don't have much impetus to question whether or not divorce is okay, but that question is vital for a woman in an abusive marriage, end quote, Sawatsky explained. Quote, conversely, happily married wives to excellent, loving, devoted husbands will naturally be more likely to question beliefs about all men being sexually predatory because it challenges her lived experience with a good man, whereas women in bad marriages whose husbands are, frankly, problematic will have no reason to discard a belief that tells her men cannot be trusted, end quote. Quote, we feel these findings offer an interesting look into survivorship bias, and it adds context to the, quote, why, end quote, behind deconstruction that is so heavily contested, end quote. And overall, quote. Overall, the study highlights the potential consequences of purity culture beliefs on women's health, relationships, and self-perceptions, suggesting that these beliefs can have lasting impacts well into married life. Quote, a lot of people are unraveling purity culture right now. There are whole docuseries on YouTube about purity balls and purity rings and, quote, true love waits, end quote, rallies, end quote, Sawatsky said. Quote, there are podcasts on the topic galore. But what we want people to understand is that purity culture wasn't just about telling kids, quote, don't have sex, end quote, but also included teachings to married women that told them, quote, you can't say no anymore because it's your job to meet his needs, end quote. Whole generations of women had their ability to consent eroded by threats that their husbands would have affairs or that they'd be failing in God's eyes if they didn't have sex every time their husbands wanted it. If she can't say no, she also can't truly say yes, end quote. End overall quote. Quote, while our findings are most relevant to those who were or are a part of conservative religious communities, especially American evangelicals, we hope that the broader conversations about how consent can be undermined by misogynistic tropes can be spurred on by our research, end quote. As with any research, there are some limitations to consider. The study's findings are correlational, meaning they highlight associations but do not confirm cause and effect relationships. Additionally, while the focus on white women aligns with the demographics most targeted by purity culture, the study does not address the potentially unique experiences of women of color within evangelical circles, where racialized notions of purity may add further complexities to these outcomes. Quote, we would love for someone to replicate our findings specifically with non-white samples, end quote, Sawatsky told SciPost. Quote, there have been some amazing articles put out recently about the effects of purity culture within a Black context that have found similar trends as ours, but have not looked specifically at sexual pain, end quote. The researchers are hopeful that their findings will inspire meaningful changes in both religious teachings and the treatment of sexual health issues among women. Quote, what we'd love to see come from this research is threefold. 1. Religious leaders simply must stop talking about sex as something that women give and men take. It's outdated, promotes marital rape, and removes a woman's ability to really enjoy her own sexuality since it turns sex into a male entitlement and female obligation. 2. We have had wonderful experiences working with pelvic floor physiotherapists in disseminating this research, and we hope that in the future, women who experience sexual pain or discomfort are quick to seek and receive treatment that is consent-focused, end quote. Quote, and finally, 3, we hope that the larger takeaway within the evangelical publishing world is that our books simply must be held to a higher standard. It's ridiculous that this teaching has been so widespread when you consider that none of them are based in peer-reviewed research and that some of the best-selling books have 0 studies in their references. We simply need a higher standard when it comes to what is passed off as advice in religious circles, end quote. The researchers also highlighted the severe lack of research on sexual pain disorders among women, describing them as, quote, criminally underrepresented in the literature, end quote. Quote, seriously, go to PubMed and search, quote, vaginismus, end quote, and, quote, erectile dysfunction, end quote, and look at the discrepancy, end quote, Sawatsky explained. Quote, higher rates of sexual pain disorders in conservative religious women were first identified in the 1970s, but there has been very little research done to date on why this trend occurs, or even how best to treat sexual pain disorders in conservative religious women, end quote. Quote, pain disorders are often discovered the first time a woman tries to have penetrative sex, and that can be very traumatic, especially considering how few women even know that sexual pain disorders exist beforehand. Our hope is that vaginismus and sexual pain become talked about more openly, so that women are empowered to seek treatment and don't force themselves to have painful sex over and over again because they don't feel there's any hope, end quote. The study, quote, Sanctified Sexism, Effects of Purity Culture Tropes on White Christian Women's Marital and Sexual Satisfaction and Experience of Sexual Pain, end quote, was published online on November 1st, 2024. Linked here. Here ends the article. Speaking of the article, here's the article featured in Sociology of Religion, titled Sanctified Sexism, Effects of Purity Culture, Tropes on White Christian Women's Marital and Sexual Satisfaction and Experience of Sexual Pain, by Joanna Sawatsky, Rebecca Lindenbach, Sheila Ray Gregoire, and Keith Gregoire. This was published on November 1st, 2024. The abstract reads, since the 1970s, research consistently links conservative religiosity with higher rates of primary sexual pain disorders in women. The effects on women's marital and sexual satisfaction and experience of severe primary sexual pain due to belief in sexually restrictive and sexually coercive gender ideological tropes common in evangelical resources are described in a large snowball sample of white American Christian women. parentheses, sexual satisfaction and function survey, N equals 5489, end parentheses. We found that belief in purity culture tropes was associated with higher rates of sexual pain disorders. Current belief in sexually restrictive tropes was associated with lower marital and sexual satisfaction, as was past belief in sexually coercive tropes. Current internalization of two tropes was associated with higher marital satisfaction, likely explained by decreased marital satisfaction among those who deconstructed, compared with those who still believe. Never believing tropes were protective for women's marital and sexual satisfaction, while belief deconstruction showed mixed effects. Here ends the abstract. This is why my personal belief is that, never having been raised in this highly religious, highly toxic to women environment, women are much better off and have much better sex education compared to women who are raised in these highly religious environments. And it is our job to make sure that women stay away as much, or at least be warned about these. I know that the choice is still theirs, but I don't want them to suffer, not like the rest of us have under these very strict religious environments. It is not fair to them, and they deserve better. I also want to point out that you will need additional access to be able to read this article. To read this journal. As shown here, if you just try to access this article from the website, it'll say you do not currently have access to this article. It's understandable because most institutions want you to pay for the article because that helps with funding, and that also tells them what studies are being accessed and have currently the most interest. So my recommendation would be, reach out to your circle, see if anyone's part of the Association for the Sociology of Religion. You can also make your personal account. You can also sign in, check your library, check your institution. If you happen to work or know someone who works through a library or for a university, they might be able to get you access. Please consider doing so through any of these options. Read it for yourself and form your own conclusions as to what you think. Now, I will link the Bear Marriage website below because they are the authors and primary drivers behind this. In general, most of their content seems to be about liberating evangelical women from patriarchal norms and patriarchal expectations, which is a good thing. As of now, I haven't seen any actual decent criticism of their work. And I wish them all the best as they continue their part to return the church back to actually valuing women as people. Again, if you have any comments or questions, or there's items that you want to bring my attention to, please do so in the comments down below, or to my email address in my profile. Thank you for watching/listening, and I will see you in the next one.